For the first time in a long time, the Edmonton Oilers defense might be better than their forward group. Are they going to score enough this year? On today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This will be my fourth NHL season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is available on all the major podcasting platforms, YouTube, and we've got your team covered every day. Today's episode of Locked On Oilers is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, on today's show, we are going to get into the nuts and bolts. This is definitely an Excel episode of Locked On Oilers, and we're going to break it down very simply. We're going to start with talking about the Oilers' goal production from last season, what the numbers say about the 24-25 season. In our second segment, we're going to pivot to the goal scoring that they lost, that they subtracted from the roster. And then we're going to talk in the third and final segment, the raw math. How many goals do they need to make the playoffs? How many goals are they missing from that total, and where the likely candidates are to replace them? So I do want to talk about this first in the abstract. So I make no bones about it. The idea for this episode, and this has been a recurring episode theme throughout my content, regardless of when I've been doing Oilers stuff, Ranger stuff, just general hockey stuff. You need to think about scoring enough goals to win enough hockey games to qualify for the playoffs. That's your first objective. Now, that changes once you get to the postseason and defense and goaltending become a bit more pressing, even though I still would argue you're better served trying to outscore your problems as opposed to defend or goaltend them away, just because of the variance involved in having to play perfect defense or have elite goaltending. So I break this down very simply. This is the Paul D. Podesta, John Podesta worked for Obama. Paul D. Podesta speech from Moneyball, where he's telling Billy Beane, you need to think about winning these games by scoring enough runs to win them. In hockey, we need to score enough goals. And we can get a rough number of what it's going to take to make the playoffs, be considered an elite team, and then based on that, we can make adjustments. So last year, the Edmonton Oilers scored 200. So last year, 2024-2025, the Edmonton Oilers had 22 different players record at least one goal in the regular season. Of those 22 players, 7 had more than 15 goals, 12 had less than 10 goals. In all situations, the Oilers had 259 goals, which was 11th in the NHL. They had the 14th most 5-on-5 goals, 168. And I do want to point this out. And I forgot about this. The Oilers had a negative goal share in the regular season last year. And I don't think it's a huge deal to have a negative goal share in the regular season, especially considering how rough that last month or so of the season was, because the Oilers were dealing with all those injuries. They were playing a pretty parsed down lineup that wasn't at full strength. So we can look at the context of those numbers and say, well, yes, the opponents outscored them at 5-on-5 in the regular season, but we can understand that they had injuries, that they had guys miss time, that they had a bunch of guys regress or play below their career averages, which we'll get to in a little bit. The next part of this recipe, and something that I do find always fascinating, when you talk about just Connor and just Leon, 206 points combined. And of course, a lot of those points overlap with each other. They are not mutually exclusive, those 200 some odd points that the Draisaitl and McDavid combined for. They overlap quite a bit. But where the value comes in, where the understanding of just how important these guys comes in, especially at 5-on-5, is their goal contribution. So the way you would calculate this, you add up all of the McDavid Draisaitl points, goals and assists, you get 206. Of those 259? Yeah, 259 overall goals, McDavid and Draisaitl contributed on 80% of them. Of the 168 5-on-5 goals, McDavid and Draisaitl contributed on 85% of those. So Of the goals and assists the Oilers scored at 5-on-5 over the course of the regular season, only 15% of that 140 some odd goals was assisted or scored by someone other than Draisaitl or McDavid. These two guys carry an enormous share of the workload, and it's why the Oilers can afford to roll the dice. And we'll talk about that more in our second and third segments, where we're going to talk a little bit about what they lost and how they think they might be able to make that up. But make no mistake about it, most teams do not have this aggressive of a goal contribution split throughout their lineup. It's just not feasible. It's just not practical. When you are this reliant on one or two players, it really limits your opportunities, because as we saw in the Stanley Cup final, especially with Connor and Leon playing together, the Florida Panthers being able to stunt those two when they were played together, it really sapped the rest of the Oilers lineup's ability to create offense, to create dangerous offense. So when you can weed that out, generally speaking, you're going to have a lot of success. Granted, not a lot of teams have the personnel or style of play in conjunction with each other the way Florida does to beat the Oilers the way that Florida did. Look, the Oilers are not a perfect team. Every team, even the Panthers, have deficiencies. For the Oilers, it was finding ways to create more dangerous offense, especially when McDavid and Draisaitl weren't on the ice. They couldn't get to the cycle. They were struggling when they were off the cycle. They couldn't get the puck between the hashes. They couldn't create high danger chances, even when McDavid and Draisaitl were out there. So you need to think about it in that respect. How do we score more offense? And of course, there is not one way to score. We have yet to have an efficiency revolution in the NHL the way we have in, say, baseball or basketball or even football to some extent, where in baseball, walks, home runs, and strikeouts, that your three true outcomes, that is the most efficient way to play, because you have the best chance of scoring runs off of home runs. Home runs, guaranteed runs, because everybody runs around the bases. In basketball, we have weeded out inefficient play. The long two is really only in the game if you're still good at that. If that's your shot, teams don't mind you taking that. But the corner three and the layup, the dunk, those are going to be better outcomes because people make them at a higher percentage than those long twos. In football, we know guys want their layups. They want their bread and butter 4 or 5 yard gains. And then depending on what the defense does, you're trying to hit certain things to get the defense to give you other things. There's a real back and forth give and take. In hockey, there's no one way to play. If you want to be a up-tempo, skill-based offense, you can be successful doing that. If you want to be a cycle, grinded out offense, you can be successful doing that. Now, the Oilers last year blended that together to some degree. I thought when the Oilers were at their best in the postseason, late in the Kings series and through the Vegas series, is when they had evenly distributed responsibilities throughout their lineup. When they were playing McDavid and Draisaitl separate from each other or together, when they were playing Nuge with Zach Hyman and with Evander Kane, and really having a high skill third, what would effectively on most teams be a checking line, but play it in a way that was creating dangerous offense. And that's really your key here. How do you create enough dangerous offense to score enough goals? Now, the Oilers have the luxury of having guys like McDavid and Draisaitl who can make plays outside of structure, who aren't as dependent on their shooting metrics, on their chance metrics, because they are good enough to outplay their metrics. And the average NHL player, the slightly above average NHL player, they are going to be a lot more constrained by environmental factors. The more environmental factors that impact the player, the more you could argue they are less impactful. We are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we return, I'm going to break down the subtractions, what the Oilers lost in terms of goal scoring, and what it means going forward, and how the fits might work coming up next. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. We've all been there, logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot or not get tickets at all. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. And that's where Game Time comes in. Game Time makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Did you know prices actually drop the closer it gets to showtime? And you can save as much as 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. If you're tired of the endless scrolling trying to find the best deal, Game Time Zone Deals pick the best seats in your section for you. And if you're wondering what the view is going to look like, Game Time has you covered with the panoramic seat view, which is my personal favorite part of the Game Time ticket experience. And if you're worried that plans might change, the Game Time guarantee has you covered with cancellation protection and more. If you're ready to take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets, you need to download the Game Time app. Create an account, use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we look at hockey as an academic subject. And I make no bones about it. I consistently compare hockey to the way I would study history, the way I'd study sociology, anthropology. And this is one of the subjects that irks people. For the conventional hockey people, for the legacy hockey people, they don't like thinking about hockey just in terms of goals for and goals against, because that saps the game of its humanity, of its creativity. That when you reduce players to just numbers, you're not telling their full story. Whereas I would argue the numbers are very descriptive in understanding what guys bring to the table. Like we were just talking about at the end of that first segment, and we'll use to segue in here. The vast majority of players are not good enough to play outside of structure. They are not dynamic enough to make plays just for themselves. That is a very rarefied air. We are talking about the top 2 or 3 percentile of players in the world who are capable of making plays outside of themselves, that aren't dependent on line mates or defensive partners, that aren't particularly relying on what the defense or the goalie is giving them. They are so unbelievably good. They are one-man offenses. I use that descriptor a lot for Connor McDavid. And if you're new here, if you're not an everydayer, when I say someone is a one-man offense, and other guys do this, Jack Hughes does this at a very high level. When Elias Pettersson has been healthy, he does it. Artemi Panarin does it. Austin Matthews, a little bit to a lesser extent. But when you are capable of getting the puck, whether it's in your own zone or the neutral zone, and attacking the offensive zone with speed, where you are gaining the zone with speed, you're putting stress on the defense and the goalie. You are creating space for your line mates to gain the zone because the defense is going to hone in on you. Because when you are that dynamic, that explosive a skater, defenses are going to respect you more, and that's going to create more opportunities. And you can just drive the net yourself if the opportunity is there. That's what I mean by one-man offense. And there are plenty of gifted players in the NHL that don't have the foot speed, that don't have the puck skills, so they can't get to that threshold. Most guys who play at a reasonably high level have 2 or 3 really good traits. If we're talking about a McDavid, a Nathan McKinnon, 4 or 5 of the 5 traits we would define as being elite or better. When we're talking about the Oilers and what they've lost, I know a lot of people say, well, Jeff Skinner, Victor Arvidsson, they didn't really work out, so there's not really a whole lot of harm done there. While neither guy really exploded or popped off, both guys played important roles on last year's team and just the raw goal total. So starting at the top, and a lot of people were surprised when we were doing playoff content and, we did crossovers with Locked On Kings, Locked On Stars, Locked On Golden Knights. Corey Perry was 5th on the team in goals last year in the regular season with 19. And don't forget, the year before, 23-24, Corey Perry wasn't an every night player. Was last year an extreme outlier for Corey Perry at age 39 to be able to score 19 goals, only playing 12, 13 minutes per night? Yeah, that is something that is not going to happen again, barring something weird. Last year, a lot of opportunities on the power play in Zach Hyman's absence, a lot of opportunities to play with Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl in end-of-game situations to create more dangerous offense. And we sang Perry's praises on this podcast during the playoffs. He was arguably the Oilers' 3rd or 4th best player for most of the postseason, doing a lot of dirty work at the net front, especially in Zach Hyman's absence after breaking his wrist in the Stars series. Perry played a really integral role. McDavid and Draisaitl were the ones who insisted that Chris Knoblauch continue to play Corey Perry up there, even though the foot speed and maybe some of the other aspects of the game that would have been better suited for somebody a little more well-rounded, whether that was Podkolzin, Evander Kane, someone who could forecheck a little bit more, whereas Perry wasn't really going to be able to do that all that much. And we continue going on down the line here. You talk about Jeff Skinner, 16 goals, 6th on the team. Victor Arvidsson, 15 goals, 7th. Connor Brown, 13 goals, 9th on the team. while none of Perry, Skinner, Arvidsson are what we would call dynamic, explosive. None of those guys is a play driver. None of those guys alone is going to be able to make enough offense for themselves that it's going to raise their line mates. But those are quality supporting cast members that are featured on good teams. And it is integral that no matter how good your superstars are, no matter how good your best players are, regardless if they're forward or defenseman, that they have quality depth around them to amplify their best traits. A great example of this is the connection that Vasily Podkolzin and Leon Draisaitl were able to form last year, where Podkolzin's not a top six forward. He's not. He does not have the skating, the puck skills. He's a tenacious forechecker. He hits a lot, but he doesn't have the puck skills to play with Leon Draisaitl. Why did he play so much with Leon? Because he was going to get the puck and getting the puck to Draisaitl. That's what we mean by environmental. Because other guys in that role, and we saw Jeff Skinner there, we saw Evander Kane there at points in the postseason, we saw Trent Frederick there occasionally in the playoffs. When you are on a line with Draisaitl, the expectation is you are going to do some of the dirty work because he is so good. It is a waste of his talent and it is a waste of his energy for him to be the one forechecking. And that's not to say he doesn't have to. Yes, there are going to be times where your best player is going to have to do some of the dirty work because the other guys on their line just aren't in a position to make a play. But when you think about this in the abstract, you need to replace 19, 16, 15, and 13 goals. So 28, 41. You need to replace upwards of 50 goals. And then you get into some of the other ones where I know Evander Kane wasn't on the team in the regular season last year, but mathematically you would pencil him in for 20 to 25 goals with relative ease. And you subtract those 20 potential goals from the 60 some odd goals they lost from the four forwards. And then, you had one from John Klingberg. You had one from Derek Ryan, obviously Derek Ryan retiring, John Klingberg with the Sharks. Those won't count, even though one each. Worth mentioning, when you lose 60 goals plus a capacity for at least 15 to 20 more in Evander Kane, replacing 80 goals in a single offseason is a lot. That is 5 or 6 really solid NHL players. That's 5 of what Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson gave you last year. So while neither Jeff Skinner or Victor Arvidsson I would classify as a successful free agent signing in the conventional sense, they both had a lot of utility. They were very functional players. Did they go above and beyond? No, they weren't. They were limited in what they did. In Jeff Skinner's case, he really struggled to earn Chris Knobloch's trust, so it made it harder for him to earn more responsibility, to earn more playing time. Think about it like this. While they were imperfect for what they were brought in for, they scored enough, they contributed enough. And look, Jeff Skinner contributed at a really high rate considering the minutes he played. To hit that goal mark, to be that high on the team leaderboard, is pretty good for a guy who the coach didn't really trust all that much and missed quite a lot of games for being healthy scratch. So keep that in mind when we're talking about the Jeff Skinner Edmonton Oilers experience. We're going to take our second final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll tackle how the Oilers replace those numbers coming up next. So be sure to stick around. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we break down how the Oilers are going to score enough goals to make the playoffs. And I said this last week, I said this earlier in the summer. It's really weird to feel better about the defense than the forward group. I think there are just simply fewer questions about the defense, and that's really the impetus for this episode. Sure, the goaltending room is more than enough question marks to, even if the defense is above average, that it might not bear out that way statistically because there's just so much variability in how Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard perform. So you can definitely take what I'm saying about the defense with a grain of salt there. But when you have pretty established group, Bouchard and Ekholm, we'll see how healthy Ekholm is, but you would assume full summer off. Further removed from that injury, the healthier he'll be. Darnell Nurse and Jake Wallman. And look, I am very hard on Nurse because the contract is not good. But Jake Wallman's a pretty good NHL defenseman. You have Brett Kulak, who showed the ability to play pretty much anywhere in the lineup last year. And then you have Troy Stetcher and Ty Emberson for that last spot. That's a pretty defined, established group. Yeah, that last spot, Stetcher or Emberson, there's some conjecture about who's going to prevail. I personally would like to see them give Emberson a little bit more of a run because he has the capacity to probably be a little bit more than he is, and they won't know unless he plays. So that's something to keep in mind. But when we're talking about the Oilers and their offense, we know, first of all, a lot of guys underperformed their career averages last year. So that's the first thing. When we talk about the Oilers and their regression last year, they had 16 players score fewer goals than their average NHL season. Amongst that group, Connor McDavid, Zach Hyman, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Corey Perry, Jeff Skinner, Victor Arvidsson, Connor Brown, Adam Henrique, Vasily Podkolzin, Darnell Nurse, Kasperi Kapanen, all scored under their career averages and goals. And yes, there are a few more, but when we're talking about, 1 versus 3, not a huge difference, but that is an opportunity for some positive regression. Of course, we can talk about that in terms of context because the Oilers were better defensively as last year went along, and part of being better defensively is probably being a little bit less aggressive offensively, a little bit more of a focus on defensive responsibility, a little more of a focus on good two-way hockey to minimize dangerous offense against, and that comes at the cost of more offense. Do I think there's more room on some of these guys? Yeah. I think the fact you had a lot of guys like Draisaitl, I know Draisaitl led the league in goals. He was over his career average last year. Don't forget, he missed quite a few games down the backstretch of the regular season. McDavid missed quite a few games down the backstretch of the regular season and had that suspension. Zach Hyman missed a pocket of games both early in the year when they claimed Kapanen off of waivers and then down the backstretch of the regular season. So I think there's a reasonable case for for Zach Hyman to score probably 30 goals. I think if Jeff Skinner, I can't believe I did that again. If Zach Hyman scores 30 goals, okay, that's only 5 out of like the 70 you need to replace, but that's 5. I think Connor McDavid should probably be closer to his career average of 40 goals a season than he was at 26 this year. I think right there, you're looking at 10 to 15 goals in just positive regression from a better environment. I think we can talk about the fact the Oilers' power play took a step back year over year last year. I think there's plenty of opportunity there for more goal scoring for Hyman, for McDavid, and for Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. With all 3 of those guys underperforming their career averages and goals, that would tell you something was off about the environment. I think there's a strong case to be made that the focus on defensive responsibility, which is a good thing from Chris Knoblauch, and the power play taking a step back probably cost all 3 of those guys something in the ballpark of 4 to 5 goals apiece. Okay, that's 15 goals off that total. Okay, now you're down to 50. You brought in Andrew Mangiapane. His career average in goals is 20, though that is heavily skewed by his 130-goal season in Calgary. But we can pencil Andrew Mangiapane in for 15. So really quickly, you're back. Okay, 35. 35 goals is doable. Who has the capacity to help replace that? Well, can Adam Henrique give you 2 or 3 more? Can Vasily Podkolzin give you 4 or 5 more? If you really trust him, if you really want to play him with Leon Draisaitl, can you get 4 to 5 more goals out of Podkolzin? Okay, then you're down to 30. Now we're down to 30. Well, who else in the lineup has the potential? Well, Trent Frederick. He didn't score a goal in the regular season, but his career average is 13. That'll get you down to 17 from 30. Okay, we only need 17 goals from Matthew Savoie and Ike Howard combined, as if they're both in the lineup at the same time. And then you have David Tomasek, who could potentially be a 5 to 10 goal guy. Really quickly, you can get to the math of how the Oilers score enough. Now, that some of that is incumbent upon guys doing things they've never done before. That is why we are generally more confident in our predictions, our projections, if you will, for guys who have long track records. Like Zach Hyman, underperforming his career average. And look, I know Zach Hyman has the 150-goal season in there. That does skew his goal scoring total a little bit higher than it otherwise would be. I feel reasonably confident that if Zach Hyman is playing first line right wing, if he is on the first power play, he'll get his shot on goal total back where it needs to be. He will shoot around his career average in shooting percentage, and that will get him to 30 goals. That alone is the value of understanding the numbers. I think you can make an argument that maybe at this point in his career, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins probably isn't going to be a 20 to 25 goal guy. And that's not the end of the world, but that is something you do need to account for in our roster construction and our preparation. Where else could the Oilers make up goals? I'm glad you asked. Jake Wallman, a full season of Jake Wallman, who can score something in the ballpark of 8 to 10. Again, that's not a huge number, 10 goals, but from a defenseman, okay, that's an upper quartile player. You add that in the spot where you would have had Brett Kulak, who was over his career average in goal totals last year, and you slide Kulak down a spot into a lower point in the lineup. Okay, he's not going to have as many minutes, so he won't have as many shots on goal, so he won't score as many goals. But Jake Wallman should be able to help drive offense, to create more offense, and that's really the key here. The Oilers at 5-on-5 last year, they left meat on the bone. They were outscored at 5-on-5. They left meat on the bone on the power play. And when you have both of those, when you have guys who underperformed their historic averages, their production, all together at the same time, that tells you it was something about the environment. Whether, like we've said, it's the Chris Knoblauch defense focus or if it's the power play regressing, the opportunity for just positive regression to make up a lot of this goal difference is there. Then you account for the unknown, Tomasek, Ike Howard, Savoie. You can get 15 to 20 goals from those three guys. I don't think that's crazy. I don't know about you guys. You let me know in the comments. Do you think asking for Savoie, Howard, and Tomasek to combine for 15, 20 goals in conjunction with the positive regression of Hyman, McDavid, Nugent-Hopkins, maybe Henrique, a full season of Jake Wallman, a full season of Trent Frederick, that seems like the math is working there. And look, I know these are based on projections, that these are educated guesses, that these are based on statistics, and you could have an extreme outlier. Maybe you get a 40-goal season from Zach Hyman. Maybe you get a 20-goal season from Zach Hyman. Those are both well within the range of potential outcomes. The key here, when we're talking about this from a construction standpoint, a roster building standpoint, how realistic is what you need? If the Oilers needed 40 goals from Howard, Tomasek, and Savoie, I'd be very nervous because that's a lot to ask of guys who don't have the NHL experience. 15 to 20 for three guys, I think that's reasonable. You think about the capacity for those guys to play alongside a McDavid, play along a Draisaitl, that's a chance to get maybe a little bit more out of them than you thought you might be able to, at least to start out. That's how you think about this. That's how I think about this. When we're in the offseason and we're talking about just purely evaluating the roster, goals in, goals out, what's the difference? Who can make up that difference? Who's left? That's the key here. But that will do it for today's math-heavy edition of Locked On Oilers. I want to thank everyone that made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We've got your team covered every day. Be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night over on the Locked On NHL feeds, wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.